Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Grieg, Essential Works for Beginners. One of you asked me to do Grieg. It shocked me. It really set me back. I thought to myself, goodness gracious, why does anyone want to do Grieg? Everybody knows Grieg. Everybody likes Grieg. Well, there I am, trapped in my own little box of assumptions, because beginners are beginners. They don't know anything. If you're a beginner, don't feel bad. You're it's nothing, no shame in not knowing, because you don't. And I was assuming that people only want to hear about like the more difficult composers, the ones who are less well known, the ones who wrote fewer popular pieces, because Grieg was enormously popular and his output is actually rather large, but it's mostly in small forms. It's mostly songs and piano pieces, and very few orchestral and larger works, and those tend to be very well known, and we all know that. Well, who am I to say what a beginner does or doesn't know? I mean, I would be terribly presumptuous of me, and I think you caught me. You caught me being terribly presumptuous, so I need to apologize for my presumption. I think it's an excellent topic to talk about Grieg, and the nice thing about it is because he wrote some of the most popular pieces in the repertoire, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Only need to talk about 5 works. It's really very, very simple to do your essential Grieg, and after that you can go and knock yourself out listening to other stuff that he wrote. And really, it's so much of it's so beautiful. It's wonderful music. Absolutely wonderful music. So let's start with the Piano Concerto in A minor. The Grieg Piano Concerto is one of the great piano concertos of the Romantic era. It had an obvious model, which was the Schumann Concerto in the same key. And if you know Schumann's concerto, you'll see that there are resemblances between the two. Not thematic, but conceptual. And actually, it's very, very interesting to hear them one after the other, and they're often coupled on the same disc, so you have plenty of opportunities to do that. Now, the Grieg Piano Concerto is such a meat and potatoes piece. One of the things I mentioned was that it seems to be not as popular as it used to be. Then, of course, all of you wrote in and said, oh, yes, it is. It's on like BBC3, Classic FM every 15 minutes, and it was played at the proms every year, and it does get played. It does. But I'm talking about, it used to be like essential recording stuff for most pianists. Any great pianist recorded the Grieg Piano Concerto. Now, not as much, I think. And I think the reason is because there are so many fine Norwegian artists that it's become almost specialty repertoire. I talked about that when I was mentioning what happened to the Grieg Piano Concerto. But it's still one of the great concerti. It's got some of the best tunes in the business. And it's wonderful. So it may be, this is me again, it may be that as a beginner, you won't encounter it quite as readily as we used to, particularly now that everything's going to streaming media and all this stuff. I think that it's actually harder to find some of the basic stuff that used to be just played all the time over the radio, or at least, on cartoons or broadcast or recorded by everybody. Again, that's me, but it's definitely one of the basic Grieg pieces for sure. Next, the Peer Gynt Suites 1 and 2. I mean, you can't do a salad dressing commercial without mourning from the Peer Gynt Suite. Remember that? Or in the Hall of the Mountain King. I mean, it's on commercials. And the other reason I'm happy that you said I should do Grieg is because the Peer Gynt Suite number 1 is one of the pieces I talk about extensively with lots of musical examples in my How to Listen to Great Works playlist. That series, Peer Gynt Suite number 1 is the piece I chose to introduce, strategies for listening and to describe form and other things like that. So it's actually a wonderful work to get started with. for anything classical. I mean, I heard it. It was one of my very first pieces of classical music, and I loved In the Hall of the Mountain King, which Grieg, by the way, described as a piece of cow turd. So, it goes to show, right? He thought it was just something he wrote it was deliberately. It describes trolls, so he wrote something that he thought was nationalist garbage to describe trolls, and it's just marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. So the Peer Gynt Suites 1 and 2 are definite Grieg starter works. If you want to hear the complete incidental music, that's been recorded too. Incidental music is just the 19th century equivalent of a film score. A composer wrote music to accompany a play on stage. Theaters had full freestanding orchestras and choirs and soloists, and so composers would write songs and choruses and atmosphere music and overtures and between act scene change music and all kinds of stuff. So it's about an hour long if you get the complete thing, but it's got singing in Norwegian, and so it's easier, I think, to just start with the 2 suites, which are gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. Next, Grieg wrote beautiful chamber music. And I think it's really, really important when you're beginning listening to classical music that you start to understand that chamber music does not mean small. It means small forces, but not small forms. It doesn't mean smallness of emotion or less expression. And there are 3 absolutely gorgeous violin sonatas for violin and piano that Grieg wrote, which you really ought to hear. They fit beautifully on a single disc if you're buying physical media compact discs, and you'll love them. They've also been arranged as concertos, actually, for violin and small orchestra, which is also fun and beautifully recorded on Naxos, for example. But you should get to know some of the chamber works, especially by composers who didn't otherwise write works in large forms for big orchestras. Grieg did not. There's an early symphony, which isn't very good, that was only discovered or unbanned, in the past few decades. And there's the piano concerto, and that's about it for large form orchestral works. But there are some beautiful chamber works. There's a string quartet, there's a cello sonata, and these 3 violin sonatas, which are exceptionally beautiful. And they belong in any essential Grieg collection because they represent his best efforts in large forms, multi-movement forms. So those have to be on the list. And then the lyric pieces for piano. Now, like I said, the majority of Grieg's output was for piano, and he arranged all of his orchestral pieces for piano, and he orchestrated some of his piano pieces. But the largest body of piano work he did was a bunch of things that came in several books or sets called the lyric pieces. And they are just what they say they are. They're vignettes. They're little character pieces with fanciful titles. One of the most famous, for example, is Wedding Day at Troldhaugen. Troldhaugen was Grieg's home in Norway. I've been there. It's like a tourist destination. And, it's got a catchy tune. Da-da-da-da-ba-ba-da-da-da-ba-da-da-da. I mean, some of these pieces are incredibly catchy. A pile of them were orchestrated, and they make up an orchestral piece called the Lyric Suite. They were not orchestrated by Grieg. And they are really his most comprehensive body of work. And you sample them. You don't have to get them all. You just dip into them and sample them. They're very similar to Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, for example. Those were the models for the lyric pieces for piano. Many, many pianists have recorded them excellently. And you can just, take a look at what the titles are, see which ones appeal to you, and give them a shot. And you'll be very, very pleasantly surprised. They're incredibly enjoyable, and you can listen to as much or as few as you like. And last but not least, the Holberg Suite. Now, the Holberg was a Norwegian poet and playwright from the earlier 19th century, 17th century, or 18th century. What am I saying? Not 17th, 18th century. And Grieg wrote a piano suite called From Holberg's Time. And then he took 4 of the movements from the piano suite and made a beautiful suite for string orchestra. So you can hear either of them. You can get the piano original, or you can listen to the string version of it, which I just particularly love. It gets played constantly. It's one of the things that I don't know about, Classic FM or whatever in the UK is doing. But here on WQXR, Grieg's Holberg Suite was on every 15 minutes. I mean, you heard it constantly. It's a standard work for string orchestra and one of the great 19th century string orchestra pieces. The others are the Dvorak and Tchaikovsky string serenades and the Holberg Suite, and there are other pieces for strings from the 19th century, the Elgar Serenade for strings and others that are very, very beautiful. This is one of those. And so you should hear that too. And once you know these things, you can just go on and explore to your heart's content. There are many other gorgeous works by Grieg. There really are. I mean, there's Sigurd Jorsalfar incidental music, which he wrote, which is really lots of fun. And there's the ballade for piano, which is a great work in variation form, and many, many others. So, I don't have to mention them all here. These 5 will get you going, and that's all you need. So if you are just getting started in classical music or just getting started with Grieg and you don't know who he is and you don't know what he did, this list will, I think, provide your point of entry. And I hope it works for you. And I can only apologize once again for thinking that for some reason it wasn't necessary to talk about him. That really wasn't very fair, was it? But it tells you something about me, about the world of classical music, about what our expectations are and what our assumptions are, and how we need to be more open-minded and accommodating, always. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me, and take care.